Hello, everyone. I'm Joan Kerr, and this is WorldCanvass from International Programs. Glad to have you with us this afternoon. Nice day here in Iowa City, and we're coming to you from the Senate Chamber of the Old Capitol Museum on the campus of the University of Iowa. I'd like to begin by thanking our partners, University of Iowa TV, the University of Iowa Pentecrest Museums, KRUI-FM, and Information Technology Services. The program is being recorded for statewide television and radio distribution over UI TV, Iowa Public Radio, and KRUI-FM. Our topic tonight is East Africa, and our guests will introduce us to the people, geography, language, history, and issues facing this vast and complex region. Among other things, we'll learn about an exciting new educational initiative that links the UI and the East African nation of Tanzania, and we'll also reflect on the first 50 years of the Peace Corps with two volunteers whose assignments took them to Africa. So please let me introduce the people on stage with me now. Jim Giblin is University of Iowa history professor and co-director of the African Studies program, and he's here in the middle. Liombe Echo, or Leo Echo, is a professor of journalism and mass communication and co-director of the African Studies program, and he is here to my left. And on the end is Edward Miner, international studies bibliographer at the University of Iowa Libraries and an East African specialist. So please give our guests a warm welcome. Jim, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind, and perhaps you can help set the stage for us. What are we talking about when we talk about East Africa? What countries?
Well, let me begin by thanking you, John, for this opportunity to visit with you tonight. East Africa, well, we can say that the East African community is made up of Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. So those are the nations conventionally thought of as East Africa.
Excuse me a second. Do we need to pull the microphone back? We have some feedback? Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Okay, so please continue.
Repeat?
Oh, no, I think we can just move on from there. But so you've kind of named some of the countries involved in this area of East Africa. Tell us a little bit about what their political structures are like now, how much influence the colonial past, the European colonial past, has had on the way these countries are set up today.
Okay. Well, when you ask a historian of Africa to tell you about the colonial period, you're likely to get a mouthful because that's our bread and butter. I think we can say that many of the basic economic and political institutions in modern Africa were created during the colonial period and continue to persist there. It's a long story, and I won't tell it all here, but I would say that I think Africa's position within the global economy was essentially created in the colonial period, and that's very much a position of dependence in many respects. And the basic political institutions that exist in modern East Africa today were to a great extent created in the colonial period as well. Those institutions introduced by colonial rule tended to be very centralized. That is to say, power tended to be centralized and controlled very much from the top. And these were systems in the colonial period which were very much undemocratic. They were not systems which provided the rights of citizenship to African people in these territories. And to a very great extent, Africans in East Africa have been continuing to struggle for their democratic rights right down to the present day.
I think that there may be among people hearing this program some understanding of where Kenya is, some understanding of Uganda perhaps for various reasons. They're large countries, and we've seen a lot of movies made about these regions. But what is the commonality between the countries that you have just named there? Why do we break off East Africa as a segment of this very, very large continent, apart from the fact that it's on the eastern side? Is there some other unification of the peoples in this area we call East Africa?
Well, there is to some extent. Across the region, many of the languages, and there in fact are hundreds of languages spoken in East Africa, many of the languages are quite similar to each other. And at the same time, across the whole region, cultures are similar in many ways as well. But to a great extent, the definition of East Africa is really a kind of a convenience. And it probably oversells the notion that East Africa is significantly different from the neighboring regions of Equatorial or Central Africa and Southern Africa and so forth. Because to a great extent, neighboring nations like Malawi, Zambia, the Congo, which we don't think of as being part of East Africa, really in many ways share many of the linguistic and cultural similarities that we see across the East African region.
You have a long connection with Tanzania, and
Right.
we'll have a chance both in this segment and the following segment to talk a little bit about the work you're doing in Tanzania. But can you kind of briefly sum up the sort of work you've been doing in Tanzania for these last many years?
Sure. I first went to Tanzania in 1982. I went as a doctoral student. I was then doing my doctoral research. I was from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I spent 2.5 years in Tanzania in that period, and then came back to the States, and among other things, found employment at this university, and returned to Tanzania again in the early 1990s. And my wife and I have been returning to Tanzania every year since the early 1990s. I've done research in various areas of 19th and 20th century Tanzanian history. My earlier work was concentrated primarily on environmental change and the way in which East Africans, Tanzanians, responded to changes in environmental conditions. Later on, I moved more into doing social history and became very interested in changes in social relations, the changes in relations between men and women, changes in relations within families. And in many ways, that's the interest that has really continued to be my major emphasis down to the present, actually.
Yeah. And you teach the environmental change or developmental change course in Tanzania every summer, is it?
Yes, well, we beginning in the winter term of 2009-2010, my wife, Blandina Kaduma Giblin, and myself began to co-teach a series of courses in Tanzania for University of Iowa students. We taught an initial course in that winter term. Then last spring, in May and June, we taught a second course there. And we'll do this again this May and June as well. We have a number of students who are keen to go with us, and we're delighted to have them. And in the spring semester of 2012, we will for the first time teach a semester-long program in Tanzania. But that will be a program that will not involve simply courses taught by us. It will also involve courses taught by Tanzanian colleagues.
Wow, terrific. And the African Studies area here at this university is quite strong.
Yes,
yes. I mean, it's a major area of concentration within the history department.
Indeed, we're very fortunate in my department, in the Department of History, to have two historians of Africa. My colleague Elke Stockreiter teaches women's history and the history of Islam in particular, and she's done fascinating research on the history of Islamic cultures on the island of Zanzibar. Zanzibar is part of the Republic of Tanzania. And she's explored using very difficult sources and learned that in many ways Islamic courts actually provided women with more safeguards of their rights than is usually thought to be the case, and in particular safeguarding their rights at the time of divorce, for example.
Yeah.
So Elke is one of the prime players, you might say, in East African studies here. Marie Kruger, who is a member of the Department of English, could not be here tonight because she's attending a conference in Germany, in Frankfurt. But Marie is a specialist in African literatures, and in particular in the study of literary portrayals of of HIV/AIDS and people who have been affected in various ways by the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So those are a couple of the members of our faculty who couldn't be with us tonight.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think I'll turn just for a moment here now to Leo Echo. Nice to have you with us. And so you're in journalism and mass communication, and are from Africa yourself. And you are doing some research not only on media at large, but also on cartoons and new expressions of freedom in Africa, particularly in East Africa. Take it from there and tell us what you're up to.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I was born in West Africa, but I carried out most of my professional activities in East Africa. I was based in Nairobi in Kenya, so I got a chance to go to all the countries in East Africa and produce programs and experience the culture and the situation of the media over there. What we are experiencing right now, going on in North Africa and the Middle East, this wind of change that's sweeping occurred in sub-Saharan Africa 20 years ago. It happened just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Most of those changes we are witnessing now in the North happened in the South. And so we had a situation where there was a drastic change in the situation of the media. I will take a few examples. In Tanzania, before 1990, the media were very strictly controlled under the Chama cha Mapinduzi, the ruling party of Julius Nyerere, the president. And actually, when he nationalized the main newspaper, which was a British settler newspaper, the president of the republic was the editor of the paper. And he appointed Benjamin Mkapa to do the job for him. But he himself, he was like the editor-in-chief. That tells you the state of the media. It was very tightly controlled, and it was a mouthpiece for the government. If you go north to Kenya, the president was Jomo Kenyatta. The media were very tightly controlled. There was not a single cartoon of the president. It was not allowed. And of course, the same was in, you go up to Uganda. It was, the media were really there was no media freedom to speak of right up to 1990. But when the wind swept through, we witnessed the most astonishing creativity coming out of. We had a satirical press that came out. There were cartoonists from Tanzania and Uganda and Kenya, right up to Ethiopia. Ethiopia, which is, the main big country just north of this East Africa region we have been talking about. So the media changed drastically. We started seeing cartoons of presidents, politicians. The media started holding the elite and the government responsible for their actions. And Uganda was one of the first countries where we had a liberalization of broadcasting. Uganda was, it was not the most advanced East African country, but it led the way in the sense that they had a Uganda Communications Commission, which gave out licenses to private broadcasters. And then there was a very interesting experiment in broadcasting that has been tried only one time in the world, one other place, in Burkina Faso. And this is the experiment. The broadcasters who got new licenses took outside broadcast vans and they went to bars. And they will give somebody who was educated, maybe a lawyer or a college graduate, and then when people are drinking and having fun in the bars, the people will say, what is your opinion of the government? What is your opinion of this issue or that issue? And they call them in Uganda the ekimiza, the bar room discussions, political discussions. And of course, the government did not like it. The government of Museveni did not like it, because imagine people who have been, they have a little bit of alcohol to fuel the debate. So they said all kinds of things about the government, and individuals talk about libel and slander. There was everything. And it was the most freewheeling broadcast experiments anywhere. The only other place it was tried was in Burkina Faso, where the government set up a radio. The radio station was called Radio Come In and Say Your Piece. So, I mean, if you are pissed off, or pardon my expression, if you're upset with the government or with anything, just go into the radio station and say your piece and go home. That was the experiment. But ultimately, that experiment did not last very long, because in Uganda, because people started threatening to sue the radio stations for libel and slander and things like that. But that shows you the change from the very tight government control to a radio stations that were taken down to the level of the people. And we saw some really amazing cartoons that criticized the governments, and so it was a very exciting time. And even though the governments have consolidated control to a certain extent, but the genie is out of the bottle. The people now have learned the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and there are institutions, like broadcast institutions in the 3 countries, in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, that help to ensure that there's an equitable distribution of broadcast frequencies, and that broadcasters are not directly interfered with. I also need to point out the area of the new media, the internet. The internet was one of the first avenues of free speech. The governments, first of all, could not control. They did not master the technology. They didn't know very much about it, so they couldn't control. So newspapers went on the internet. Sometimes they were hosted in South Africa. Sometimes they were hosted in other countries. And so they were there on the internet, and the government could not do anything to control them. So what we have witnessed since 1995 or thereabouts is the gradual Africanization of the internet. You see, when the internet was first popularized, the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was only concerned about creating internet connectivity projects in Africa. They wanted as many African countries as possible to be connected to the internet. The United States Agency for International Development, USAID, poured in a lot of money, and all the countries that were considered to have sufficiently democratized were given some finances, some funding to connect to the internet. But there was absolutely no consideration about the content. What were we connecting the Africans to? So essentially, there were no laws, there were no rules. It was like anything went, and so there was chaos. But fortunately, a number of projects came up which called the Africanization of the internet. In Tanzania, they had the Swahili localization project. They created word processing in Swahili. In South Africa, they created word processing in Zulu and in Xhosa, the click languages. And so for the first time, we have African languages on the internet. People can write. You see, if I write my name on the internet, it underlies it. It tells me there's an error because my name, so Africans who went on the internet using standard word processing, all our names were wrongly spelled to begin with. So it just culturally it didn't work. So Africans decided we were going to try to localize, and this localization project has progressed faster in some countries than others, but it has made it possible for Africans to create content for the internet and to use the internet for local development purposes rather than being just consumers of material from all other parts of the world. So those two developments we've had in the last 15 or so years on the African continent.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Jim.
If I may, I'd like to follow up on Leo's comments with some news that I think it will be very interesting. Leo has described the struggles to expand the rights of expression, the rights of media, and so forth. He's described some of the challenges in Uganda in particular to rulers who are reluctant to leave office. In Uganda, in fact, there is an election going on right now that will re-elect an incumbent president who is very reluctant to leave office. And this is some of the background to an event we're going to, that the African Studies program will hold on April 1st and 2nd. We're going to have a symposium on the future of multi-party politics and democracy in East Africa, and we have a very exciting group of visitors who will come and participate. The best known of them, at least in East Africa itself, is a politician named Dr. Willibrod Slaa, who is the primary opposition leader in Tanzania. He ran for president in last November's general election in Tanzania and was defeated. I must say defeated soundly, but in fact won more votes than any other opposition politician. He's going to be joined here in Iowa City by his wife, by two very prominent journalists from Tanzania, Bernard Mapalala and Generali Ulimwengu. And in addition, we have a very distinguished array of scholars, some of them Americans and some of them East Africans, all of whom are specialists in the study of East African politics. One of them, in fact, a professor emeritus of this university, Professor Joel Barkan, who was for many years a member of our African Studies program. So I did want to find a way to sneak that in here. The public is warmly welcomed, and it should be a very exciting event.
If I might just add one more thing. I talked about the Africanization, the localization of the internet. The most exciting example happened in Ethiopia. I would show you, you see here, this is the Ethiopian script. The language is Amharic, Ge'ez. And so the Ethiopians wanted to write, using typewriters to write in their language on the internet. And there was nobody who was, it was not financially or commercially viable for Microsoft to do. And Microsoft couldn't sell because it's just one country that uses this language. So what the Ethiopians did, Ethiopian expatriate computer engineers and computer programmers here in the United States and in Europe, they got together and they wrote software. And this software is now readily available. They give it away to anybody who wants. You can download it and use it to write Amharic on the internet. So this is an example of the kind of thing that happened. And when Microsoft saw that there was indeed a market, Microsoft created a language localization program in South Africa. So it says, wow, there are 11 national languages in South Africa, and the populations are not insignificant. There is some money to be made here. So Microsoft followed the steps of the Africans. So that's an exciting change that is going on.
Well, thank you, Leo Echo and Jim Giblin. Well, let me turn to you now, Ed Miner from the libraries, and you also work with WriterNet, which is an amazing project. You might like to describe a little bit here, following up on what Leo just said. But I know you did field work in Uganda, and you've made many trips back to East Africa on behalf of the libraries and perhaps other projects as well. Tell us a little bit about your work.
Well, the main thing that I do is to build library collections in support of African studies. Not only African studies, but Middle Eastern and South Asian studies. But insofar as my expertise, I am an East Africanist. I earned my doctorate in African linguistics from the University of Illinois. And originally I was interested in the structure of Bantu languages, but then really interested in how language is used in urban interethnic communication, and that's what my research in Uganda was about, the use of languages among ethnic groups in dynamic social environments in the urban context, and the emergence of hybrid languages and social identities in Kampala. And and also the ideologies of language, that is, beliefs about what language is, what it's good for, how official interventions into it can affect social behavior, and so forth. But my interests in Africa became so broad that ultimately I aspired to be a librarian, because I interact with all disciplines, all African studies disciplines, as an Africana librarian. And the collections that we have here in African studies in our library are particularly strong in East Africa. We've always had specialists in East African studies, in particular at the University of Iowa, and so we have rich collections of Kiswahili literature. And more recently, this is a special kind of project of mine, because this is such a media-hungry campus. There's so much interest both in feature film and in documentary among the social sciences and humanities. We voraciously collect locally produced videos from East Africa. All three major East African countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. We collect music and feature films on DVD and documentaries, and a wide array of music as well. Also, going back to what Leo said about the Africanization of digital content, it's something that anybody who does scholarship these days has become familiar with, that we're becoming much more accustomed to things like electronic journals and electronic books. And a lot of scholarship is out there on the internet. There's emerging new forms of scholarly communication, like scholarly blogs, journals that are born on the internet. And these kinds of formats benefit African scholars to the extent that they're readily accessible where there is internet connectivity. So these publication formats not only create content that is readily accessible to Africa through the internet, but it also allows African universities and African scholarly societies to create scholarly content that then is visible to the world, because the visibility of scholarship and knowledge produced in Africa by African scholars has always been a problem, because African scholarly journals are not well distributed. Now, we do in our library subscribe to a large number of scholarly journals from African universities and scholarly societies. They're hard to search because they're not well indexed. You can't really access that literature well through many of the databases to which we subscribe. Almost you have to find the references on the internet before you know where to look. But the emergence of full digitized content on the internet is really raising the visibility of African scholarship, including various experiments among African universities in posting electronic dissertations in their own institutional repositories. And it's no longer just South Africa that's doing this. Universities in Nigeria are doing this. Makerere University in Uganda has an institutional repository on which their master's theses and PhD dissertations are now available. In my case, I have a particular interest in the curation and the preservation of primary source materials for the study of African history. And I'm chair of a consortium of which the University of Iowa is a member, called the Cooperative Africana Materials Project, which is an affiliate group of the Center for Research Libraries in Chicago. it's been in existence for more than 50 years, but more recently, what CAMP is the acronym for the group has begun to do is to enter into directly with collaborations with African institutions to collaboratively digitize their content, and we're thinking very seriously about how in a time of financial scarcity for everyone, for American scholars, for African scholars, that we can start to think about resource sharing, to share to the extent that we're able what we have, and for African institutions to share what they're able to digitize, so that we all have access to more to help sustain scholarship about Africa everywhere. So this is something that the University of Iowa is involved in through its membership in CAMP, and it's something that we're doing in among other places, Uganda, the digitization of African archives. And our interest in CAMP is really for African institutions to develop the capacity to do this themselves, so that it's something that we've wanted to do for years, but until digital technology really became low cost, there was not really a feasible way to share resources. But now, with these technologies and how affordable they are, you see the visibility of African scholarship in the way you've never seen before, plus ways of saving some facsimile of archives that are literally crumbling, in sort of subtropical circumstances. And so this is something that we're very involved in, and the fruit of one such project is a partnership between Camp CRL and a for-profit publisher called Redex. That's an archive of historical African newspapers, of which Iowa was a charter member, and which we have access to here at the library.
Yeah, Theo, you're...
If I may just add, we have a very extensive African Studies program here at the University of Iowa. It cuts across so many disciplines. We have Africanists in the College of Medicine. They do from medical anthropology to history to geography to political science to journalism. Across the board, we have a lot of people, a lot of scholars who study Africa in many ways, and so it's a very exciting campus to be in, and I personally am very grateful to Edward because he makes available to me cartoons from all parts of Africa, which I don't have to go there. In the old days, I would have to literally go to certain countries to get their cartoons, but with the new technology, research becomes easy, and I can go to the library and get cartoons from all corners of Africa.
Jim, tell me what your experience is in Tanzania or in other parts of East Africa. How readily can individuals get computer access in their own homes? Is that quite available now to people, or is it only a few people in the population who would have computer access in their own homes?
Computer access in their homes. Now, I can't quote you a percentage offhand, but I would say the percentage of people who have that is small. Yeah. It's not impossible, and some people have access. More people access the internet through their work and their places of employment, or their schools, or internet cafes, which are very many in East African cities. Really, though, the technological revolution that has really affected African life has not been so much the internet, it's been the cell phone. Yeah. The changes introduced by the cell phone have been extraordinary. Indeed, we were just talking about this at home the other night. Someone was saying to us that, well, probably in the villages people don't have cell phones, because after all, in the villages there's no electricity, so how can you possibly charge your phone? it couldn't be further from the truth. People find all sorts of arrangements. People will put automobile batteries on the backs of bicycles and take them to the nearest town 20 miles away where they have electricity, and they can charge them there, and then they bring them back to the village, and of course charge a small fee for recharging each phone, and the changes have been extraordinary. We in ways that we would have never thought possible as recently as 10 years ago. We now have the ability to keep in daily contact with people through all of our friends and relatives, whether they live in the city or in small villages as well. And I could go on all night about the changes that have come about. One of the funniest stories I've heard about cell phones came from a colleague of ours who is a Kenyan, comes from Kenya, and he was telling us about how recently the change or the innovation in corruption has been that when you're now stopped by the police in Kenya and forced to pay a bribe in order to continue on your way, you can now pay your bribe through the phone. So no cash changes hands. There's no evidence. There is no sign at all of malfeasance.
I completely concur with him. The biggest communication change in Africa is the cell phone. All corners of I was very surprised when I went back to, there are places where there is no electricity, but people have cell phones. And they somehow managed to keep those phones charged. And it is said that, studies have shown that cell phones have added 60% to the development of most countries. Because people don't have to travel anymore. They can communicate very easily. Even the Maasai, the cattle rearers, way out there in the savannas, they can find the price of cattle in the market in Nairobi without having to take the cattle there first, without having to go there. They are able to communicate using cell phones, and they can do all kinds of business. So that has really revolutionized not only the economy, it has revolutionized education, it has revolutionized the healthcare system because people can communicate with cell phones.
Not to mention romance.
Of course, that too. So the cell phone is something that is again being Africanized. You see, the dominant power right now in Africa is China. China makes very cheap cell phones, mass-produced cell phones. They are like 1/10 the price of the cell phone we'll buy here in Iowa City. And so they are mass-market cell phones, and they are cheap, and so they are easily sold. And so it's this kind of economic penetration that has really given China a foothold in very many areas. But that's it's another topic here. Sure.
Well, I'm going to say thank you, Leo and Ed, for being here with us in this first segment. Thanks to you too, Jim, but I'm going to ask you to stay a second. Thank you very much for sharing these thoughts with us, and please thank you to our guests. Thank you. We're going to invite another guest up now to join us, Dr. Christopher Komoro. If you would please come up and take a seat with us. Dr. Komoro is here visiting from Tanzania, and Jim and Dr. Komoro can tell you about some of the projects they have in the works. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you. So, Jim, would you give us an introduction to Dr. Komoro here?
I'd be delighted to do that. Dr. Komoro is an old friend, a colleague of many years, and also, I should say, in Swahili we would say a shemeji, that is to say brother-in-law. This is Dr. Komoro's second trip here to Iowa City. He came in the mid-'90s and spent a semester here working on his research. Dr. Komoro holds a PhD from Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and was for many years a member of the Department of Sociology at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Some years ago, he decided to moved to what was then a brand new institution called Mkwawa University College of Education, in Iringa, Tanzania. Dr. Komoro, I'm sure, will tell you more about his own scholarly work, but he's made very important contributions to our understanding of the epidemiology of HIV/AIDS in Tanzania, and particularly to the social context in which the HIV/AIDS pandemic originally developed in East Africa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Komoro, I'll start off with a light comment. When I first met you a couple of days ago, I was saying how nice it was that you had come when our winter freeze was starting to let up a little bit, and you weren't quite convinced that it was actually as warm as I was telling you it was. But now I see that you studied in Canada, so this winter is nothing to you, huh?
Well, it isn't, but I was a student there, so I had to suffer the consequences of winter. But now I'm a private person. I don't have to get to Iowa when it is that cold. But I'm grateful that I came with the warm weather. I just arrived from Dar es Salaam where it is teeming hot. You are very uncomfortable. You don't even take your breakfast. If you want to take your breakfast, you have to hide into your own room and take it light, no shades, no what, then you'll enjoy your breakfast. But I think people living in cold weather are much healthier than those living in warm weather. Well, what should I say? I brought the nice warm weather, but when I leave on Sunday, the cold weather from Alaska should come.
Come back.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You are not yet through with winter.
Well, I know that we at the University of Iowa were excited to learn about this semester-long project that will be taking place. A large grant was awarded to the university and Study Abroad to create this semester-long program, as Jim explained a little bit earlier. Can you tell us something about the development of this university in Tanzania, the university you're connected with? This is a very important project to your nation.
Thank you. The university that I teach, Mkwawa University College of Education, is a constituent college of the University of Dar es Salaam. There are two constituent colleges. One is based in the city. It's called Dar es Salaam Constituent College of Education. And ours, which is in Iringa, approximately 570 miles from the capital city, in a pleasant, cool, mountainous area, the likes of Montana, but much more beautiful. So this university was established in 2006, and the other university in Dar es Salaam was established in 2005. The government saw the need to expand teachers' education because of expanding secondary schools in the country. There are so many secondary schools, and the complaint in all schools is lack of teachers, particularly science teachers. So our university is completely a teaching university where teachers are trained. We have 3 faculties, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, where I come from, and the Faculty of Education, and the Faculty of Science. All these are training teachers for secondary schools and teachers for teacher training colleges.
And you mentioned secular schools. What are the other schools? There are religious schools, I guess, in Tanzania that would offer education as well?
Well, we have 2 types of school, public schools and private schools, and they are all treated the same in terms of receiving government funds and in terms of being allocated teachers from the 2 big colleges that train teachers.
Anything you'd like to say at this point about the semester-long program that's being set up? You already mentioned that it would be in the spring of this next year, and you'll be taking students, I guess, from the University of Iowa as well?
Right. Well, maybe I should begin by giving a bit of background.
Yeah.
I think one thing that all of us in the African Studies program share is a enjoyment in actually spending time in Africa. Well, that's something we all have, and we enjoy spending time in African cultures and African societies for many reasons. And so some years ago, we began to realize that the university was beginning to make more of a push to get students to do study abroad. And we began to say to ourselves, well, why is it that more of our students aren't going to Africa? After all, it's a lot of fun. We thought about this, and eventually we began to look around for support to establish study abroad in Africa. First, we obtained a grant from the U.S. Department of Education, and then more recently a grant from the Department of State. And those two grants have allowed us to mount the study abroad courses that I described a few minutes ago, as well as the semester-long program that we're now beginning at Dr. Komoro's institution. This is, in fact, the program at Iringa in Tanzania will be the first program of our own. That is the first UI study abroad program in sub-Saharan Africa outside of South Africa. And so this is going to be a brand new and I think very exciting opportunity for our students. Iringa itself, as Dr. Komoro says, is really a beautiful place. It's a highland area, very much unlike the tropical coast where Dar es Salaam is located, which is very, very hot and humid. Iringa is temperate, cool temperatures all year round, and it's really a wonderful place to be. The campus itself is spacious, large fields and playing fields all over the place. And the town of Iringa is a very pleasant and manageable city of about 200,000, 300,000, a very walkable city, I might mention as well. And so for many reasons, we think that Mkwawa University College is a very good base for study abroad. And it will, in fact, be the first study abroad program in roughly the southern half of Tanzania. There's very little opportunity to do study abroad in Tanzania outside of the capital city of Dar es Salaam. Now, our students next spring will take a variety of courses. They'll take courses that are taught by me and also by Blandina Giblin, who will also be teaching there at that time. And in addition, the UI students there will teach courses, will take courses taught by Mkwawa faculty, including Dr. Komoro. So they'll have an opportunity to work a bit with us, but also at the same time to see what it's like to take a course in an African institution of higher learning. The students will take a combination of work in the humanities and social sciences. Mkwawa has a very strong curriculum in areas such as literature, history, geography, and social sciences generally. And in addition, we're developing a program in the Kiswahili language. Kiswahili is the national language of Tanzania, and it's the language, let's say the language of the street. There are a lot of Tanzanians who do speak English, but to really get to know Tanzania well and to enjoy it, you really need to know some Kiswahili. So all of the students who go to Mkwawa next spring will work on Swahili, and some of them will have an opportunity to learn from the ground up if they have not taken courses here before. Others who go to Mkwawa will have taken Kiswahili courses here on campus, and they'll be more advanced and will then be working on conversational skills as well. I might mention this. Africa in general, and certainly Tanzania in particular, it's a great place to learn a language. People are very forgiving of mistakes, they're very welcoming of foreigners. People really enjoy getting an opportunity to meet people from other parts of the world. They appreciate enormously the effort by foreigners, particularly Americans, to learn at least the basics, the basic greetings, if nothing else, in their own language, and they're very encouraging. So it's not a forbidding, sometimes people describe France, for example, as a culture where it's very difficult. If you speak Quebecois French, for example, and you go to Paris, then people may not like the way you speak, but this is not the case in Africa. People are very welcoming and encouraging encouraging of anyone who's making an effort to learn their language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I may describe Mkwawa University, it was constructed in 1958. It was finished in 1958, and it was basically meant to be a European school. Mm-hmm. Some of our famous students who have passed there is D. Clark from South Africa. This was basically a European school, and other buildings are European buildings. It's a very spacious campus. One part of the university that was constructed became a high school. It was called St. Michael's and St. George's, but the St. Michael part was completed. The St. George's part was not yet completed. And when it was the high school, it had the best golf courses that Europeans from Kericho in Kenya and from Malawi used to come to play golf. But we still have spacious areas, and we are now beginning to make a university of our own, an African type of university. But the best thing, if you ever manage to come to Mkwawa, we have one of the biggest in Africa, the second biggest national game reserve called the Ruaha National Park, where we have the biggest elephants in East Africa and the biggest lion in East Africa, lions that are smart to climb the trees. Unfortunately, the last time when we went with Mary Grace Weber and Professor Janice, the lion was hiding. But when you come, we'll ask the lions to be available for you. The giraffes are not camera shy, so they are readily available for tourists.
Well, can you tell us, Dr. Komoro, in this remaining time, something about the work you've done on HIV/AIDS in Tanzania?
Right. I've done a lot of research in HIV/AIDS. That research was created while we were in a sabbatical here at Harvard University at the Department of Social Medicine. The Department of Social Medicine used to invite scholars from the three East African universities, the University of Dar es Salaam, Makerere University, and Nairobi University. So every year they invited scholars to Harvard. And while we were there, we East African scholars wrote a proposal to jointly study HIV/AIDS back home. And our research had two components, a socio-anthropological component and the epidemiological component. Our aim was to demystify the beliefs that the local people had about AIDS. And how did we do that? We went to an area where HIV/AIDS was highly pronounced, an area where the first 3 suspected AIDS cases were identified by a regional surgeon, an area closer to Uganda where there was a lot of belief that infection was caused by being bewitched, and infection used to affect younger people who were crossing the borders all the time. And those people crossing the borders were the major victims of HIV/AIDS. But when they come home, they said, we have been bewitched. So our study indicated that it is a question of behavior. So we have a lot of publication on HIV/AIDS. Our study managed to create 4 PhDs, 2 PhDs in epidemiology in Tanzania and 2 PhDs in Sweden, 1 in epidemiology and the other one in social science. But I've continued to work on HIV/AIDS, and the last study that I've done in collaboration with the Tanzania Food and Drug Administration was following those people who are using ARVs. So that work has been documented in AIDS care. So if people, if they're interested, I can give them a reference.
As has been the case in the rest of the world, as people learned more about AIDS and how it was transmitted and so on, there are public policy initiatives, public education initiatives that have gone on. Is that the case also in Tanzania? Is there a deeper understanding among the people of how this disease spreads?
the understanding now is much more there than in the 80s when the epidemic started. And a lot of other organizations are on the ground working towards reducing infection. In fact, Tanzania had established an AIDS program, a national AIDS program that not only monitors but also intervenes in the HIV/AIDS process. Mm-hmm. It is called Tanzania AIDS Commission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. What more would you like to say about this Tanzanian connection before we break?
Well, you know, I would like to say this, Joan, since Dr. Komoro described his work about HIV/AIDS. I don't like to paint a bleak picture of Africa, yes. But it is the case that Africa has been more deeply affected by the HIV pandemic than any other part of the world. And so you can't escape when you go to Tanzania and many other African countries, seeing the evidence of the toll that HIV has taken. It's all around you. And certainly we've been going to Tanzania for many years. We have many contacts and relationships there, and we know many people. We've lost many people as a result of this pandemic. But I would say that, you know, one thing I try to explain to students when they ask, well, why are you so interested in Africa, and why is it that you think it's so important to go there? I try to explain that when you get a chance to understand other cultures well, you begin to realize that people are really all about the same, and that human problems and dilemmas are just about the same everywhere you go. But what you learn when you go to different cultures is that people have different ways of solving the problems and dilemmas that they encounter as humans, living human lives. And in the age of HIV/AIDS, I think one of the things that I've learned from my time in Tanzania is a deeper sense of charity, because people have had to work through that. Dr. Komoro described in one of my classes last night the way in which HIV was and is an affliction which is often responded to with a sense of shame. The people who have it are ashamed, and people who are survivors or relatives of victims are ashamed for them. And working through that sense of shame and understanding that people ultimately are not responsible or to blame for their illness is something that I think has given many people in Tanzania, as I say, a deeper sense of charity and understanding. And that's the kind of thing I think you learn when you get a chance to spend time in another culture.
Well, and I know that among the various speakers you're going to be having here this spring, you mentioned to me that someone has done some wonderful work with the articles, the poetry that has been written by people who have been afflicted by AIDS or family members. And can you tell us?
Yes, certainly I can. That is Dr. Aldrin Mutembe, who is a faculty member in the Institute for Kiswahili Studies at the University of Dar es Salaam. Dr. Mutembe has recently published a book, it is written in Kiswahili, about Kiswahili poetry, which is in turn about HIV/AIDS. But I should explain there's a connection here. Back in the 90s, when Dr. Komoro was beginning to work out his own project during his study at Harvard, Dr. Mutembe was there as well, and they were working together, and in fact continued to work together in Tanzania on this. There are many aspects of Dr. Mutembe's work which I find extremely interesting, but of all of it, I think as a historian, what I find most interesting is his examination of poetry about something that was happening in the early 1980s, but which had not yet received a name. People knew that something evil was happening, something bad, that people were dying in unexpected ways and suffering terrible, terrible lingering illnesses. And as yet, in 1981, 82, 83. No one understood what this was, and there was no name for it. And some of the most moving poetry that he describes is about coming to terms, trying to understand, trying to give a name to an evil that as yet was not understood. I must say I find this particularly moving because I was living in Tanzania at that very time and yet had no realization that this terrible event was just beginning. Dr. Mutembe will be here on the 23rd and 24th of March. He's going to be speaking in my own class on the 24th, but on the 23rd we'll give a presentation as part of the African Studies program series called Baraza. And that talk will be on the 23rd I believe at 5 p.m., I think, Phillips Hall.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that and for also telling us about these upcoming events. And Dr. Kumaro, thank you very much for taking the time during your travels here. Appreciate it very much and hope to see you again. Please say thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you. So if you've just joined us, this is WorldCanvass from International Programs. I'm Joan Kerr, and our topic tonight is East Africa. If you'd like to hear this program again, there are numerous places in which you'll be able to find it on cable systems around the state, thanks to our friends and partners at UI TV, our local UI radio station, KRUI-FM, on Iowa Public Radio, and on the free internet listening site, the Public Radio Exchange. Please look for broadcast times and locations at the International Programs website, international.uiowa.edu. And you can also find out about upcoming events by going to that site. So I'm welcoming now our next set of guests. Hello, Blandina. Mrs. Blandina Giblin is seating herself just now here. Mary Grace Weber is right next to me. And two undergraduate students, Lauren Skiba and Sarah Manos, have just joined us. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. Blandina, we've just been talking with your husband, Dr. Giblin, about many of the Kiswahili efforts that are going on here at this university and the activities in Africa, in Tanzania, that you are also deeply involved with. So I'd like to first ask you a little bit about your teaching at the university. University of Iowa students, many kids here from the Midwest learning Kiswahili.
Yes, as John said, I'm Blandina Kaduma Giblin. Kaduma means little leopard, but I'm not a leopard. And it has a story, a historical story, but I won't tell here. And I started teaching Swahili in 1992. At that time, Kiswahili was just for students who wanted to go and do research in Tanzania, Kenya, or Uganda. But later on, it caught on students. They started, like any student that I ever had would go tell somebody else and say, you know what, you need to take this class because my teacher is the coolest teacher, but I don't think so. And it has steadily, for really all the years, it has steadily gotten a very high retention of students taking my class.
Yeah. How many students would you say you have at any one time?
When I teach, I mainly, there are two of us who teach Kiswahili, my colleague John Joy, who is from Kenya. I teach the elementary Kiswahili, so I get large classes, 2 sections, each 20, sometimes 20-something students. Wow. And the second semester, maybe some have failed because people think, oh, Kiswahili, yeah, it's an African language, it's easy. No, it's not easy. It is really hard. You have to keep up because people have no idea that the Kiswahili language has 19 noun class system. That when I talk about chair, everything has to rhyme with chair. So I can't say chair he, I have to say chair it, or my chair. That possessive has to be really about the chair, not the person. And my students kind of, sometimes they think, it's too hard. And I say, no, it's not, try. Because I love, the truth is, when I teach, I try to make Kiswahili as fun as possible. First of all, the first day I go to class, and it's a new day. It's the first day of the semester, and my students come in. I ask them, why Swahili? And they say, oh, my cousin told me, or my friend told me, or this and that. And then to ease them, I invite all of them to my house in Tanzania. I say, so if you're taking Swahili, you're going to have to come and visit me. And one of those students was Mary Grace. The first semester when she came to my class, and I told all my students, all my 27, actually, that particular semester, I had 27 students in one section, and another section there were 25. And I said, you're all welcome to come and visit. Then after the class, Mary Grace came to my office. She said, were you serious? I said, of course I was. So since the 90s, I have really opened my house, not just being a teacher here teaching, I've also invited my students to come and enjoy the Kiswahili culture, but also improve their Kiswahili speaking.
Yeah. We're going to go to you in a second, Mary Grace, but before we began the program, I asked you to help me understand whether there's a difference between what I had always heard of as Swahili and Kiswahili. Can you explain that to us all?
Well, really for Westerners, they say Swahili, but it is Kiswahili, because Ki stands for any language. So if someone speaks Luganda, for example, we would say Kiganda is not Luganda. Or somebody who speaks Spanish, we say Kihispania. So the Ki is the prefix for every language.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, so Mary Grace Weber, you've just been brought up here by your friend and your teacher, Blandina, and she apparently lit a fire under you, and she said you could come visit her in Tanzania, and you did. Why in the first place did you decide to take Kiswahili?
I had actually decided to take Kiswahili because I was planning to do the Peace Corps when I graduated and thought that an African language would be a useful skill to have and would better my chances of being sent to sub-Saharan Africa, which is where I wanted to go. And then I signed up for her class, and the first day she invited us all. And it wasn't until the second or third day that, after having been invited 3 times, that I said, really? Like, you're not kidding, you mean it. And ended up going with another student, and then, ended up studying abroad there. I had planned to study abroad in Europe, just because that was, I don't know, kind of what everybody seemed to be doing and was the plan. And she threw out that invitation, and I kind of realized that the options were much, much greater than that, and you could really go anywhere in the world, and you didn't have to wait to join the Peace Corps to go.
And you're getting your master's in urban and regional planning. So at what time, was this after your junior year that you went to Tanzania, or when did you go?
Well, I went to, when was that? That must have been 2007, I think, in the summer after my junior year, I think. And then I actually took a year off of school to start a nonprofit organization with Blandina called Travel for Change, and then after that started graduate studies.
Yeah. Well, we do want to talk about this, I think, incredibly interesting project, and hopefully very, I hope it'll have a very positive conclusion. Travel for Change, I wonder if the two of you could explain how this program came about. It has to do with tourism and keeping tourism dollars local, and I know that you had spent some time in, I think, Kenya, and you saw that there were lots of tourists coming to Kenya, but the Kenyans didn't seem to be earning much money from this tourism.
Right, yeah, exactly. I lived in a small town called Lamu, Kenya, and it was a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so that meant that a lot of tourists were interested in going, but would usually go and stay in businesses that were owned and operated by foreigners, mostly Europeans, Americans, and Australians. And very little of the profits were staying local. I lived with a family that lived in complete poverty and fought every day to put food on the table, and that was the status of all of their neighbors as well. And so it wasn't like there was a big community there really profiting from the tourism, which I felt was unjust, because it was their resources and their culture and their place that people were coming to see. And the idea for Travel for Change started after kind of spending some time with Blandina and really being able to not just travel as a tourist and meet people who lived there and kind of have an expanded network there. And then seeing that this is, the type of opportunity that the Giblins were offering to students, and that people were really, really captured by that, I guess, and were interested in much more than just scratching the surface and safari tourism and visiting Zanzibar, but you could do a whole lot more and really engage in the culture and keep your profits local.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what stage of development is this program in? Is it Travel for Change is something where local business people or people who want to get involved with the program tell you, I could offer this, and there's a central registry, or how does it operate?
Right now, we're having our first initiative is being started in a town called Njombe, Tanzania, which is near to Iringa, where Mkwawa University is. And we're essentially building an eco-lodge there, and then are consulting with local business owners and community members about what sorts of activities that they'd be interested in doing, and then having tourists participate in those and getting an avenue of income generation that way. So we're really just at beginning stages still, still developing the lodge, yeah.
And do you have some further thoughts about what this will mean to the people in your home area?
Tanzanian women work really hard. They are the backbone of the family, and a lot of mothers are the ones who really put their sons and daughters in school by maybe making baskets or making chapatis or donuts, which are called mandazi, or whatever it is that they can sell to save money for their children. And Mary Grace and I thought that if we started Travel for Change, in which people can come to Tanzania not as a safari thing, but just to see Tanzanian people. Because I guarantee you, sometimes when people talk about going to Africa, they think that it's only the Maasai, are the Tanzanians or are the Kenyans. But Tanzania itself, it has 120 different ethnic groups. And so why not my home state? Why not the women in my home state get the chance to be involved in something like this and really get to teach people who will come as tourists cooking or basket making, or maybe taking a little trip to some place where they can see the beauty. Because I'm from the Southern Highlands, in which it's the same state is where Dr. Komoro is, and it is very beautiful. Tanzania is very diverse. So when I tell my students that we have pine trees in where I come from, they're like, what? But that's Tanzania, what do you mean? And I say, yeah, pine trees and apples and peaches, all these things that you wouldn't think they're there.
Yeah.
So.
Sounds just fantastic, and I wish you good luck with that. And we have two undergraduate students here with us tonight as well, Sarah Manos on the end, and Lauren Skiba as well. Thank you for coming, and I know that you have both studied abroad in Tanzania. So what I'd like to get from each of you is just the sense of the place. What was surprising to you? What was just unbelievably terrific? And what may have kind of thrown you off kilter for a little while when you saw the differences between Tanzania and your life here in the States? Lauren, perhaps I'll go with you first.
That's a lot. And it's like, there's just so much good about it. And I think I was like, when I first got there, I was so tired. It was like midnight, and I was so jet lagged. It was the first time I had ever studied abroad or gone abroad ever. And I was in shock. It was so completely different and amazing. And I remember writing in my journal that I kept every day, like, I'm here, like, I'm here in Africa, like, I did it, like, I can't believe it, like, it was just amazing. Every day was new, like, we learned so much, and it was, like, just like they were saying, like, a totally Tanzanian local experience. We were in Dar for a while, and then we went to Njombe, and and everyone was so nice. Everybody we walked by said welcome and held our hand and got to know us, and I don't. It's like it's hard because it hurts like coming back and being like, you know, you have to talk to people who went there. Like those are the only people who really get it. And you know, I could say all the cliche things about studying abroad and how like it's so, I don't know, but it is. I mean, it's everything perfect and wonderful, and it was an amazing experience. It was my first study abroad experience, and it was amazing. I'll never forget it. I have to go back. That's what I tell myself every day. I have to get back there.
Yeah, yeah. And for you, Sarah, what was your experience like?
I've been trying to get to Africa for a while. It's part of what I want to do with my life. Not part of, it is what I want to do with my life. I want to work in post-conflict education throughout sub-Saharan Africa. But there was one question that everyone kept asking me: what if you get there and you hate it, Sarah? And for me, you know, I first tossed an idea at Mama about, you know, hey, can I come live with you? But here's the thing, we're going to have to spin this as a study abroad. And then my other professor, Professor Giblin, who I often call Baba, said, wait, we have one, actually, that we're starting up. And so I went, and he had mentioned something about, you know, Tanzanians being so welcoming and being so forgiving of the language. If I had any advice for any student that wanted to go to Africa, it would be get out of the compound, get out on the streets, get out in the neighborhoods, talk to people. You know, there were a lot of times when I would be with Mama or Baba, and, you know, I'd need to ask somebody a question, and they, no, wait, can I ask first? And in my clumsy Swahili, I would ask the question. I didn't always understand the answer. Thank goodness they were there. But I found that, you know, when we had downtime, when we weren't, you know, we had classes, you know, at their home, like inside, and we'd talk about history or culture or Swahili, and then, you know, we had some downtime to do things. You know, I was out that gate as soon as I could be, you know, just to go talk to people around the neighborhood, just to practice Swahili, get to know people, just talk. And there were times, speaking of frustrating things, that was both good and frustrating at the same time. I wanted to be alone. I wanted a chance to sit down and write in my journal and have a Pepsi and whatever, and I'd go down to the local pub, which is where you'd go to get a soda, and 15 seconds, and I'm surrounded. So there was nowhere to be alone. But the experience was so rewarding, because as soon as I opened my mouth trying to speak Swahili, trying to talk to people, they were so willing. Everyone was like, your Swahili's so great. I'm like, I can barely say my name. But it was a really, really amazing, rewarding experience. And, you know, for anyone that has any sort of aspiration to work abroad, especially in Africa, the go. You know, because there is that nagging question, what if I get over there and I can't handle it, I can't do it? Well, there's only one way you're going to answer that: go. Mm-hmm. And that's what this program did, and it absolutely, as I call it, got my Africa feet wet, and they're wet, and they are starting to dry off, and that's not good, so I'm trying to go back next year, so yeah.
And you said you want to work in post-conflict resolution?
Post-conflict education. Throughout the both East Africa and Central Africa. I'm really interested in the Great Lakes region, and Swahili is, you know, widely spoken in East Africa, but it also has managed to kind of trickle into a lot of other regions. So it's helpful to have that as a base. Not only that, but because it is a Bantu language, and there are so many other Bantu languages that are spoken throughout all of Africa. It's a really great foundation for learning other Bantu languages, Kinyarwanda, Kikongo, you know, all of these other languages that are going to be key to me working in that whole region. Mm-hmm. And it's a great base for that. And the experience was a great base for that, you know, being able to find out if I was going to hack it, and, mm-hmm. you know, if I wanted to go back, and if this really was for me. And turns out, absolutely. And so, yeah.
Yeah, great. What do you plan to do, Lauren?
I am in international studies and global health. So, I don't know. I hope to go back and study like healthcare systems and HIV/AIDS and everything possible health. I'm not a medical student, so just, healthcare education in rural Africa, and yeah, it was just an amazing opportunity to just get my feet wet, exactly.
Yeah. And your work in urban and regional planning, will that involve Africa in the future?
Yeah, I hope. Yeah, I hope so. I went into urban and regional planning because I felt like I had a lot of interest in kind of development work in Africa, but not necessarily the skills to pull it off. And I felt like urban planning is a much needed field, and it's not necessarily recognized or really given enough attention or resources in most countries and in developing countries especially. And so I think there's a definite need for addressing issues like urbanization and densification in a very proactive way.
Yeah. So you've done a good job with these students who've come to your classes and then gone off to Tanzania.
Frankly, my students, these students up here, they're my daughters. I mean, I have a very close relationship with my students because I look at them as my own children. And as a mother, you want the best for your kids, and they have done it.
Well, thank you all very much. Were you going to say one more thing?
I'd like to add, in full disclosure, and as another of my hats, I am the program assistant for the Tanzania Study Abroad program. And I'd like to say to any prospective students that you should go, and you should go now. Being a student in Africa is a wonderful perspective that you don't necessarily get if you go back later as a tourist, as a backpacker, as a worker. Being there and learning the language, and even just the word mwanafunzi, which is the translation for student in Swahili, opens more doors than you could possibly imagine. And doing it now, I think, has shaped, Lauren and Sarah and my own, and I think most of their other students, the path that they've taken thereafter. So I think there's a lot to be said for being active right now and just going.
Right. Well, congratulations to you all, and thank you for coming to talk with us tonight. Thanks very much. Please sit down. I'd like to invite our next two guests up now. Ari Samsky and Renugan Raidoo are two anthropologists, and they're going to share some of the work they've been doing and will be doing. Ari Samsky is a postdoctoral research scholar here at the University of Iowa in international programs and working with the Global Health Program. And hello, Ari. And Renugan Raidoo is a senior here at the University of Iowa who will be studying cultural anthropology at Oxford University next year. He was just named Rhodes Scholar at the University of Iowa, so congratulations to you, and welcome both of you. Ari, I thought we could learn a little bit about the work you've been doing, studying pharmaceuticals and their sort of free drug exchanges with African nations. It's a very interesting area. I think we'll all want to hear what you have to say.
Right. Well, my perspective is I'm a medical anthropologist, which is a cultural anthropologist who takes the field of medicine as the culture that he or she studies. And I did my dissertation fieldwork on two related pharmaceutical donation programs. So these were programs where big pharmaceutical companies decided through a very complex process to donate drugs for two specific tropical diseases. The first program was they donated the drug Mectizan for a disease called river blindness or onchocerciasis, which is a blinding parasitic disease transmitted by black flies. And that donation began in 1988. And then 10 years later, another large pharmaceutical company decided to donate azithromycin or Zithromax, which is a broad-spectrum antibiotic, to combat another tropical disease called trachoma, which is an infection of the eyelid that also causes blindness. So it's interesting that you use the word exchange, because part of, we talked about this previously, but part of what I investigated was what are these things, what are these donation programs, are they exchanges? And it turns out that depends on who you ask, what's being exchanged. Basically, the way these programs work is these large pharmaceutical companies manufacture the drugs and ship them to client countries, and then either the national government or, in some cases, international NGOs that have a local presence will accept the drugs, and then they get them out to people, usually in villages, because these diseases really are diseases of impoverished areas. The river blindness occurs in usually in river areas where there is very, very little pollution, because the black flies can't survive in highly polluted water, oddly enough. So these usually tend to be rural areas. There's not all that much urban river blindness. So in sort of rural areas with subsistence farmers are the typical areas where you find river blindness. So these are poor people, and they're people in isolated areas. Trachoma occurs in very dry areas, because having consistently dry eyes or having wind-blown grit in your eyes can aggravate or encourage the development of the disease. So these were usually I visited. The reason that I'm here tonight is that I visited onchocerciasis and trachoma foci in the Morogoro region of Tanzania. And I feel like a little bit of a tyro here. I was only in Tanzania for a short time, but
yeah.
Anyway.
But when I hear about, drugs being provided free or at little cost to a nation that has, severe illness like this among its people, it seems like a great thing. It seems like sort of an unadulterated good. But there are obviously people who are being told, take this and you'll feel better, want to know what's in that drug or want to know what the repercussions could be.
Right. Yeah, so I spent a little over 2 years studying this, and I came away with a sense of very deep ambivalence. And I was remembering today, thinking about having to speak about it tonight, that I at my dissertation defense, a professor said, Ari, nobody wants to hear about ambivalence. So I'll tell you, they're very good. The programs are very good in that I was just looking up tonight that the Mectizan donation has distributed 1 billion treatments since it started in 1988. And the Zithromax donation has distributed, I think, over 225 million. So that's a lot of treatments. And the drugs are very effective, they're very safe, and they work. It's a once-yearly dose, will prevent these diseases that do make people blind. And one of the things that the advocates for these programs and the pharmaceutical executives who administer them and the NGO tropical disease experts who also help administer them will always tell you is that in the African context, blindness affects more than just the blind person. And there's statistical data that shows that it specifically affects women, that young women often, if they have an older relative who goes blind, will stay home to help that person out and help them navigate. So there's certainly extremely positive consequences for individuals and for populations who receive these drugs, that they get the good biological consequences of taking the drug. There also are questions that I find very troubling that go along with this. One thing is that there's a concept in the anthropology of medicine called pharmaceuticalization, which refers to the reduction of medical care to access to pharmaceutical goods. So that means medicine is really a very broad thing. It can involve therapeutic talking, visiting with your doctor, surgical procedures, health and wellness training, diet, and so on. But the current reigning power in the practice of medicine around the world is the pharmaceutical product. That's what we all love because it's very fast and usually very powerful. So these donation programs are reinforcing a pharmaceuticalization of medicine in Africa. So that has a kind of epistemological consequence for the practice of medicine and how people understand medicine and what it is to have access to medical care. Is that access to a doctor or is it access to a drug? The people who I met with in these 5 villages that I visited in Tanzania had a very sharp understanding of what was going on in this situation, and they understood that pharmaceutical products were an important part of the puzzle, and they also understood that they were a tremendously valuable good, but they were in a way resentful that they didn't come along with anything else. They didn't come along with a clinic. People in this highland area near a town called Gairo also complained that they didn't come along with wells. They had very limited access to water. And one of the best ways to combat the disease trachoma is not even to take medicine, it's simply to wash your face every day. But these people were in a very dry, it was extraordinarily beautiful, but it was a very dry highland area. where they had very, very little access to water. They would have to walk for hours to get water. So these people who were subsistence farmers mostly had what in an American university setting would be a very nuanced critique of the medical practice in the area. They were saying, look, this is too focused on giving us these free products. We need to have a dispensary nearby with even a pharmacist to help us with access to other drugs. They were also resentful that they only got free access to these two specific drugs. Every other kind of drug they had to pay for. They were, I think, subsidized for most of them. But they would say, so this was actually where the exchange concept came in, that the people who I met with, I interviewed with a translator named Donatus. I tried as hard as I could to learn Swahili, and as you were saying, it was extremely difficult. The only phrase I could memorize was farasi anakula karoti, which means the horse eats the carrot, if I remember it correctly. Which actually everyone was so friendly. If I busted out that phrase, people would generally laugh, and I think it improved their opinion of me. So now I can't remember what I was saying. When I was interviewing, when I was interviewing people, they would say, "Look, we did everything that you asked us for." They were referring to me as kind of a metaphor for, it was actually local Ministry of Health personnel who would come in and train them how to become participants in these disease control programs. So they would say, look, we did everything you asked us for. Can you get us some additional help? Can we get something, drugs for malaria or a well, things like this. So they envisioned this donation program as a partnership or as an exchange. There's anthropologists often study gift exchange, which started with a French sociologist named Marcel Mauss, who was a student of Emile Durkheim, and he wrote a book called The Essay on the Gift, that he was actually analyzing data that had been collected by field workers. He didn't go out into the field himself. But he talked about how exchange of gifts created durable social relationships, and that by giving someone a gift, in certain contexts, you create what's called a reciprocal obligation with them, that by giving them something, you are creating an expectation and an obligation in them to give you something back, usually with interest. So these people were thinking about these goods that were coming into their communities, and they were thinking about them in the context of an exchange. So they felt like they were obligated by receiving these goods, and the way that they interpreted that obligation was that they were obligated to swallow the drugs, that if they were given these drugs, they were obligated to take them. And with the trachoma control program, there were also some hygiene strictures that went along with it, like washing your face and keeping your house clean. So they felt like, okay, we've completed one circuit of this gift. We've received the drugs, and then we've discharged our obligation by taking them and by doing what you guys said. Now it's time for you to return some interest on that. And you meaning whoever it was who was giving the drugs to them. And the knowledge of where the drugs were coming from was a little shaky. The Ministry of Health did education programs, but people didn't necessarily absorb them, just like here in the US, people don't absorb PSAs all that well. So they knew they were coming from Europe or somewhere, but they weren't real sure. They weren't asking specific pharmaceutical companies for compensation.
Were there occasions where people in any given village refused to take them?
That's an interesting question. The 5 villages that I visited, I asked that question frequently. In all of these villages, the village councils had established laws that assessed a fine or jail time to people who refused to take the drug. They understood that it was an important public health goal to make sure that everybody in the village took the drug, and from a public health perspective, that's really true. So they had come up with this juridical mechanism for enforcing the fact that everybody took the drug. They said, yeah, there were some people who didn't take it, and I saw sheets of their figures, and they were generally in the 90s, but not at 100%. So it didn't totally cover everybody, but that was the goal, to get 100% coverage. Usually when people refuse the drug, the people who I talked to told me stories about the rollout of these programs in the area. I went to areas where the programs have been running successfully for quite a long time, because I wanted to get a picture of what they looked like when they were going well. And they said when the drugs first came to the community, people thought, what is this? These drugs coming from Europe, we have to take them. They didn't have a very good understanding of what they were for. Everyone has to take them whether they're sick or not, which is, of course, something that, people the world around don't really want to take medicine when they're not feeling ill. Mm-hmm. So people told me, when the drug first came to the village, I thought it was a sterilization program, which is a very typical narrative when Western drugs come into African communities. Yeah. And they said, but we watched our neighbors and we watched our own bodies, and we saw that the drugs didn't make people sick, and we saw that there were babies born, lots of babies born after the drugs came in. So they had this very keen scientific, empirical observation of themselves and one another and their communities that they used to get a scientific understanding of the drug that they weren't totally willing to accept from these messages from the Ministry of Health.
Yeah. And these were not drug tests, right? From
No,
the pharmaceutical
Yes,
company's point of view, they were not testing the population or using
These were
them
drugs
as
that had
picks.
gone through their clinical trials in humans many years before. Ivermectin actually began its life as a veterinary drug. It was, if any of you have dogs or cats, if you give them heartworm medicine, usually the ivermectin is the active ingredient in that. And then the company that produces ivermectin reformulated it for humans, and they did additional clinical trials to see that it was safe. So this was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a scenario where the drug companies were using African populations as a way of finding out if drugs were deadly or not. These were both safe drugs. And Zithromax, many of you may have taken the Z-Pack. It's a short course of antibiotics. So.
Well, thanks, Ari. I'm going to turn now for a second to Renugan Raidoo, and nice to have you here, Renugan.
It's nice to be here. Thanks.
And I know that when you begin your term at Oxford next year, you're interested in studying cultural anthropology.
Yes.
And so tell us what appeals to you about that as a study area.
Well, I think I first became interested in cultural anthropology, even though my family background isn't in anthropology. I guess I come from a family of scientists. But I first became interested in anthropology when I moved to the U.S. Because I grew up in South Africa, and we came to the U.S. in 2001. And one thing that I noticed was, of course, that everything was incredibly different. I came from a city of about 4 million people that was very diverse on the east coast of South Africa, with much better weather, I think, than the Midwest. And then we moved to Vermilion, South Dakota, which is about 10,000 people, and not very much diversity. But one thing that I guess I began to realize after spending some time in the U.S. is that culture is something that's very complicated. I mean, when I came to the U.S., it ended up being much more than sort of Pop-Tarts and Super Bowl, which are things that I thought were essential to American culture, I guess, before I came.
Yeah. Well, your own family background is I think, quite interesting. Your Indian heritage going way back, and was it your uncle who spent time at Robben Island with Nelson Mandela?
My great uncle, and actually one of my great aunt's ex-husbands, both of them spent quite a lot of time in prison with Nelson Mandela. My great uncle, his name was Murgia Dhanapati Naidu, and Nelson Mandela talks a little bit about him in A Long Walk to Freedom. He died when I was quite young, but I do have a lot of memories about him. He would come to our house often, and he always told me that he was my favorite, or that I was his favorite. But I think he told my sister that too. And he was a remarkable man, I think, because after being through all that he went through, of course, for his political beliefs, he still came out the other end with a certain sense of humility and a foresight to not resent his oppressors. And one thing that he always used to tell us was that you can't really blame people for history, and sure, you can critique it and try to improve on it, but even our people thousands of years ago oppressed tribes in southern India, and so no one is without is without a bad history.
And your particular interest in cultural anthropology, as I understand it, has to do with communication between perhaps Westerners and people in a village somewhere in Africa, trying to smooth the communication between people at different levels in society?
Well, I guess I don't know if I have a particular interest yet. Maybe when I start graduate school, I'll find something. But that's definitely something that interests me insofar as it applies to my own history. And I think often there's a sense, as I sort of hinted at before, that cultures exist as these like monolithic civilizations that sort of talk between each other and sometimes clash. And but I think communicating is something that requires a deconstruction of that. We can't really think of each other as Pop-Tarts and Super Bowl, because I don't think that of all of you anymore. And so I am interested in communication insofar as it's played a large role in my life at the very simple linguistic level. I mean, on my first day of school, I asked the girl next to me if she would lend me a rubber. And so I mean, there are sort of simple linguistic things like that, but also participating in culture in a larger sense and sort of trying to understand what other people go through. I think is important and requires a suspension of this idea that cultures exist as these monolithic civilizations.
Yeah. Is that your experience too, as studying anthropology? You know, you're trying to figure out what goes on inside individuals and people who live within cultures.
Right. Well, you can look forward to many, many hours of talking about how culture is not a model in anthropology grad school. That's absolutely the case. That culture is. There are many different ways of understanding culture and looking at how culture influences behavior and how culture changes how you interact with other people, and then that also brings power into the equation, especially if you're talking about communication between the what we might call the developed world and the developing world in a sort of euphemistic sense.
Yeah. So what other goals do you have when you head off to Oxford, and your future is a bright one, I'm sure. What most interests you about this next phase?
Well, apart, of course, from being involved in a very active and vibrant intellectual community, which I'm very much looking forward to, I think probably being able to pretend that I'm sort of at Hogwarts. I hear, and I see pictures on the website that people wear robes to dinner, and it all looks very sort of surreal to me. And so that's definitely something I'm looking forward to. But in all seriousness, it's actually a second big move for me geographically, I guess. First South Africa, and then to the U.S., and now the U.S. to England. And I, as someone who wants to study anthropology, I guess culture is something that very much excites me. And so, in addition to the intellectual community in which I can participate at Oxford, I'm also very much interested in experiencing and learning about a new place and a new type of people.
Any concluding thoughts from you, Ari?
Well, you couldn't pick a better place to study cross-cultural communication than England. I mean, I'm just thinking about White Teeth, the Zadie Smith novel, which I don't know if you've read, or I actually got most of the way through it, and then I saw the PBS miniseries version of it. But it's, best of luck to you.
Yeah. Thank you both for being with us here. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing. Ari Samsky and Renugan Raidoo. Thank you very much. Thanks. And we're going to finish up with our last two guests tonight are Meredith Mahy Gall and David Wylie, who are here to talk to us a little bit about the Peace Corps. Both have been Peace Corps volunteers in Africa, and Meredith is the University of Iowa Peace Corps representative. Good to have you here. And David, thank you for coming. You're a graduate student in the College of Business, and good to have you here. So we're going to talk first just for a moment about this 50th year of the Peace Corps. It's a very big celebratory event, I know, for the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps is still going strong.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time with the 50th anniversary of Peace Corps. So on March 1st is 50 years ago. This March 1st is when President Kennedy signed the executive order making Peace Corps a U.S. government agency. Since that time, over 200,000 Americans have been to over 239 countries to help those countries with their needs for trained, skilled men and women, and also to promote cross-cultural peace and understanding. Mm-hmm. Those goals of Kennedy are still the goals of Peace Corps 50 years later. To provide the skills that countries are requesting. The countries request Peace Corps come and provide people with certain skills. And then also that one-by-one individual promotion of peace. While Americans are abroad working in these countries, they're learning about what Americans are, and that we're not just Pop-Tarts and Super Bowl, and that we're learning and that we're not just the government or what they see in the movies. Mm-hmm. And we're learning when we're there what it's like in their culture and their country and their language. And we come back to events like this and we talk about it with our family and friends and we share that. Mm-hmm. And that goes to that global understanding and that cross-cultural experience that many of the women up here earlier talked about having in Tanzania.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you tell us a little bit about your experience, David? Where were you? I think you had two different overseas bouts.
Yeah, I did. So I graduated from college, actually Grinnell College, in 2006, and after that kind of fulfilled a lifelong dream and joined the Peace Corps. But I didn't ask to be sent anywhere in particular. I just left it up to Peace Corps to sort of decide where to send me. And they sent me first to the Republic of Georgia in the former Soviet Union, just south of Russia. So I was doing business development there. I learned Georgian language, which was also quite difficult. So I spent 2 years there. It was a wonderful experience, and I just knew that Peace Corps was going to be a part of me for the rest of my life. And so I went home, and I joined a program called Peace Corps Response soon after. And this is a special program within Peace Corps. It used to be called Crisis Corps. And they send volunteers overseas for shorter-term assignments in sort of high-need areas for kind of critical assignments. So I was working actually in northern Uganda, doing environmental work.
Yeah, and what kind of needs did they have? What was when they requested your services, what were the people in Uganda looking for?
Sure. Well, Peace Corps at that time was, they had volunteers in many parts of Uganda, but not northern Uganda. For about 20 years, northern Uganda had suffered a pretty brutal civil war, or actually a guerrilla war. But just in the last couple of years, that has ended, and there's been a peace treaty that's nearly been signed, and it's very safe now. So Peace Corps wanted to explore the opportunity of putting new volunteers in northern Uganda, so they sort of sent me there to test the waters. So I was working actually with an environmental organization. It was called Wildlife Clubs of Uganda, and it's actually pretty old in Uganda. It's been around since 1975, and it has a network of about 1,000 youth environmental clubs in schools all over the country. So not just northern Uganda, but that's sort of where I worked from. And so a lot of my work was just going into schools and working with youth and getting them interested in the environment and protecting the environment. Many Ugandan youth have never been to the national park, so we took a lot of youth there. But I worked on some other projects as well. I worked very closely with the Uganda Wildlife Authority and Wildlife Conservation Society out of New York. And we did a lot of work sort of helping to mitigate human-elephant conflict in northern Uganda. This is sort of a unique problem, but it happens in different parts of Africa where elephants cause a lot of destruction as they migrate. And we worked to both conserve elephant populations, but sort of help communities settle in areas where they wouldn't face this destruction. So we tried to use natural methods to do that, lots of GIS analysis and satellite tracking of elephant populations. And another project that I worked on that I'm actually continuing now, even in business school, is I'm working with a zoology professor at Mahy University in Kampala to establish a field biology research station near Queen Elizabeth National Park in western Uganda, southwestern Uganda. And we're hoping to set up basically some laboratory facilities and a place where both domestic Ugandan researchers, East African researchers, and hopefully European and American researchers can come and do work for both short-term periods and long-term periods. So I'm helping with some of the marketing and
Yeah. Sounds terrific. Now, when you were sent to northern Uganda, were you the only person from the Peace Corps in that region at that time, or were you paired up with somebody?
When I first arrived, I was the only one in northern Uganda, but a couple months later, they sent another Peace Corps response volunteer, and now they have opened up and they have volunteers there now. But it was interesting because I would talk with some of the older teachers at the school, and they remembered Peace Corps volunteers from the 60s because Peace Corps was in that area back then. So it was just remarkable the influence Peace Corps has.
Yeah, and in your situation, you were received warmly. I mean, people were happy about having this American Peace Corps guy there.
Very much, very much. I mean, it's a challenging experience, and there's a huge focus in Peace Corps on integrating into the culture, learning the language, really becoming a part of the community. But once you do, you're welcomed with open arms. And a lot of the comments that were made by some of the other presenters really resonated with me as well.
Yeah.
And I would just say as well that I was in Botswana from 1995 to 1997, which is Southern Africa, but that sense of people remembering Peace Corps volunteers, it was the 30th anniversary of the country since their independence when I was there, and it was also, they asked us to take place, Peace Corps volunteers that were in the country to take place in their celebrations because Peace Corps had arrived in the country actually shortly before they had official independence. And so most of the leaders and government people all had a Peace Corps teacher at some time in their time. So we got to march in the parade and come into their big football stadium, and we were announced as Peace Corps, we love you. And, it was just a real feeling that, through the years, the 30 years of volunteers being there, they had really helped the country.
Yeah. And what kind of training? I understand it's kind of rigorous training before you leave the States to prepare you for the country you'll be going to, not only in terms of language, but all kinds of cultural things as well. Safety, what kind of support does the Peace Corps give you before you go and then once you're there?
You spend a few days in the United States with some general orientation, but then you spend 3 months of training in the country. So you're actually in the country for the training. 3 months of intense language, cultural training, safety, health training, so that you really have a sense of, and you're trained by people from the local culture, in the local language, in the local culture. So you really get an intense training of the communities that you'll be working in, and also what you need to keep safe, both healthy and your personal safety.
Yeah. Well, I know there were times, there have been periods of time where the United States has been at odds with a given nation, and it hasn't necessarily been easy for a Peace Corps person to sort of be the representative of the United States who's in that country at that time. How many countries are we in now? Do you know?
Currently, we're in 77 different developing countries. Let's get the number, 8,655 volunteers, which is actually a 40-year high since 1970. There's never been so many volunteers in the field. So it's really exciting for the 50th anniversary.
And is it still possible for people of a certain age to go? You don't
Absolutely.
have to be.
There's a minimum age of 18, although they're looking for a skill set, a combination of education, experience, flexibility, commitment to service that, most people either need to have a bachelor's degree or significant work experience in an area, but there's no upper age limit. You have current college graduates, mid-career professionals, and active retirees. I think I heard somewhere the oldest volunteer is, 70s, 80s.
Great, wow.
And I would say from my personal experience that some of the older volunteers, well, I think the average age is about 28, but some of the older volunteers are just very, very valuable, and they bring a lot of experience and are very good at mentoring and helping some of the younger volunteers. So they're really desired for Peace Corps.
Yeah. Now, had you imagined that you would do work in Africa when you were in Georgia, for example? Had you ever imagined you might have another Peace Corps experience?
Oh, I think so, actually. I mean, I didn't know exactly what I was getting myself into going into Peace Corps, but soon after I got there and I got to site and got to work, I knew that it was going to be sort of a lifetime commitment. Right. So, so I wanted to go back.
So what was the biggest surprise about Africa for either of you?
Sure. Well, for me, I would say that going into Uganda, the biggest surprise was just the influence that technology has on people's lives in these days. As soon as I arrived, the director of my organization gave me a little memory or little stick, a USB stick from my computer, and it allowed me to connect to the internet from wherever I was in the country. I never imagined that technology, and I told him that I didn't know if we even had this in the U.S. But just the influence of cell phones are great. They're transforming people's lives. If you're a farmer in rural Uganda, you can send a text message to a particular number, and if you have a problem with your crops, your bananas, your cassava, whatnot, you can get an immediate response, an automated response that will tell you, offer some solutions to this problem. So technology is very much a part of people's lives in Africa these days.
Mm-hmm. What was the biggest surprise for you?
The biggest surprise for me, I think, and I think it's for many Americans that go to other cultures, is just the different relationship with time, the slower pace of things. For instance, in Botswana, there was a word for now, which was jonong, and if I used that might mean in a few days. And so if you really wanted to emphasize it, you would say now. And that still might just mean in a day. And there was a word that was baffling as an American, that was kantele, which encompassed a time that was a little while ago to a little while in the future. Yeah. But really, and although that was one of the biggest challenges for me to slow down, it was probably the most rewarding experience that I had there, and to really understand the value of human interaction over productivity and efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, when you were, for example, in Uganda, did you go out to clubs with friends you made in Uganda? Did you have some of that kind of socializing with the people you met when you were working there?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with the idea that you should get outside of your home and go and meet people and interact. You have to integrate into your community. So I made a lot of Ugandan friends, and I communicate with them today via email and Skype and things like that. So I would see them all the time.
I'm so interested in the way language sort of slides over, national divides. Everybody knows a little bit of English, and you may know a little bit of the language you've just learned, and somehow everybody manages to communicate. And then there's music, which is this sort of worldwide a strange conglomeration of sounds and words, and I think that the spaces between people must be getting smaller and smaller all the time. When you go as a Peace Corps volunteer to, your experience, Uganda, some of those people will know the music that you've been listening to in the States before you came, right? Mm-hmm. And will have seen some of the films you've seen, and so there are ways to connect with people that are very immediate and very kind of visceral. And then there's what you do when you're actually working together. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, that's very true. I was amazed at the breadth of knowledge that people had about America. But one of the great things about Peace Corps is that sometimes people just have the media perception of the U.S. So they've seen maybe MTV or they've seen some of the celebrities and things like that. But when you're just an average American volunteer going in and doing work, you can really change perceptions and I think improve perceptions a lot. And that's, I think, is just very, very valuable about Peace Corps. And it's something that no other U.S. government program, no other program offers.
Yeah.
I would call it the topic of the day in the staff room, because there was one teacher that I taught with who I was teaching English at a junior secondary school, and he had a satellite dish and would get, at the time it was Jerry Springer, the talk show, and so he'd come in with the topic of the day of some American thing he was curious about that he'd heard on Jerry Springer, and it really started sort of a cross-cultural dialogue in the staff room.
That's great. So you have many celebrations coming up here. You said early March?
Mm-hmm. March 1st is the 50th anniversary, and so at March 1st at the public library, the Iowa Peace Corps Association and International Programs is putting on a celebration. It's going to be a discussion, a forum for returned Peace Corps volunteers volunteers are going to talk about global issues I care about, the impact of 50 years of Peace Corps. We've got David Osterberg, Matt Lozier, and Christopher and Nora Roy. They'll be sharing how Peace Corps has impacted their life. That'll be at the Public Library on March 1st at 7 p.m. There's also going to be displays at the Public Library as well. This is a time when our PCVs around the country are recommitting to the third goal of Peace Corps, to really share their experiences and to help inspire others to serve in whatever way that they can. And I have monthly information sessions, and there'll be one on March 2nd as well. And those are at 7 p.m. in the University Capitol Center for people who want to learn more about serving in the Peace Corps. But there's this great community in Iowa City of returned Peace Corps volunteers, and there's some in the audience here today as well. And we gather together, and it's an incredible community to be a part of. You have David, who returned from Uganda last year, and you have Katie and Peter out there who were in Nigeria in the 60s, and you have an immediate connection.
I'm so grateful you could come here tonight and tell us a little bit about what you went through and help us, celebrate this great organization. So thank you, David, Wylie, and Meredith. May Gall.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So we've come to the end of another WorldCanvass. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much. And we want to thank our partners, UI TV, Pentacrest Museums, Information Technology Services. And I thank all of you for coming. Our next program will be on March 25th, and the topic is Starving for Water. And we have a lot of wonderful guests who will be talking about water resource issues here in the United States and internationally as well. So that's March 25th, a different location for that program. It's the lounge room right next door to the School of Music and University Capitol Center. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time. Good night.